Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight, we're going to take a very slow drift across the Atlantic and gently settle right into the mid-18th century. So go ahead and dim the lights, maybe grab a warm beverage or just let your eyes close if they want to. We're not going anywhere fast. Tonight, we begin with something that frankly turned out to be a massive headache for everyone involved. The American Revolution. Now, I know what you're thinking, fireworks, battle lines, musket fire, but trust me, we're going to slow down and focus on the really sleepy parts, the paperwork, the grumbling, the incredible political dysfunction, and the long, slow, agonizing drift of people who just couldn't figure out how to be happy with each other. It's all very tedious and very soothing. We start, as we often do, with the ultimate in dysfunctional relationships, the one between Great Britain and its North American colonies. Picture a slightly distant, overly strict parent. That's Britain, and about 13 moody, increasingly independent teenagers who also owe the parent a lot of money and are starting to complain about the chores. It was never going to end well. By the 1760s, these colonies had been around for over a century, which is plenty of time to develop a personality. They had their own little legislative assemblies, their own way of doing business, and they were basically used to London being kind of a blurry, faraway annoyance that occasionally sent over a nice governor, or more often, a very bad governor. The distance, you see, was the key to this whole fragile arrangement. London was just too far away to really micromanage, which, of course, allowed the colonists to get a little too comfortable with the idea of self-governance. Now, enter the 1763. We have just finished up this massive, multi-continental kerfuffle called the 7 Years' War, or what the colonists rather provincially called the French and Indian War. Britain won, which sounds great, right? They got lots of new land, mostly Canada, and everything east of the Mississippi. But winning is expensive, like really expensive. And the British national debt had ballooned to an absolutely staggering amount, almost 130 million pounds. That's a lot of zeros, even today. But back then, it was just mind-boggling. So, the government in London, which was staffed by perfectly sensible, if slightly arrogant gentlemen, looked across the pond and thought, well, those colonists benefited quite a bit from us securing all that land and fighting all those French guys. It only seems fair that they should cough up a little something extra to help pay the bills, don't you think? It makes logical sense in that incredibly paternalistic, slightly short-sighted way that governments always think. And this is where our gentle slide into revolution really begins with something incredibly dull. Taxes. The first attempt to straighten out this financial mess was the Sugar Act of 1764. Now, despite the nice, sweet name, this was not about making life better for sugar lovers. It was technically a revision of an earlier, completely ignored tax called the Molasses Act of 1733. The old tax was so high it just encouraged smuggling. Because why pay a tax when you can just find a friendly captain and pretend you didn't see the casks? Of course. The new Sugar Act actually lowered the tax rate on foreign molasses. But here's the kicker. It was actually going to be enforced. Imagine that, a law that is actually enforced. The previous laws were basically suggestions. This one came with new Vice Admiralty courts where smuggling cases would be tried by a judge appointed by the Crown, not a jury of sympathetic local farmers who also probably enjoyed a bit of smuggled rum. This meant the colonists, who were used to basically getting away with everything, suddenly felt like their rights were being infringed upon. The response from the colonists was immediate, though not yet violent. It was just a lot of very formal, very polite, and very annoyed grumbling. They started talking about something called taxation without representation.
This phrase is important, so let's just whisper it gently. The colonists didn't necessarily think they should be exempt from taxes. They just thought that if they were going to be taxed by the British Parliament, they should have elected representatives sitting in that Parliament. The British Parliament, bless its heart, just rolled its eyes and pointed out that all Britons were virtually represented, which was this very neat, very tidy political theory that basically meant every member of Parliament represented the interests of all British subjects everywhere, whether those subjects got to vote for them or not. It was a very nice theory for the people who were already in power. The colonists were not impressed by this philosophical hand-waving, of course. The British government, having completely missed the point with the Sugar Act, decided to double down because, well, why not double down? In 1765, we get the Stamp Act. This one was a little less about imported goods and a lot more about domestic annoyance. It required that a tax stamp be placed on almost all printed materials: legal documents, licenses, newspapers, pamphlets, and even playing cards. Yes, even your deck of cards needed a stamp. It was an internal tax hitting everyone, especially the two groups who controlled the most communication and influence: lawyers and journalists. Of course he'd tax the lawyers and the journalists. That's just a recipe for trouble. This tax was wildly unpopular, and it was the first time that the colonists really got themselves organized in a serious, terrifying way. You started seeing these groups spring up, calling themselves the Sons of Liberty. These were not quiet, thoughtful gentlemen discussing political theory over tea. These were merchants, artisans, and generally unhappy, slightly rougher folks who were ready to be a little more direct with their displeasure. They started with very public, very loud intimidation. Tax collectors were threatened, sometimes covered in tar and feathers, which I'm told is an incredibly unpleasant, sticky, and painful experience. Effigies of tax officials would be burned. The message was very clear: try to enforce the Stamp Act, and things will get physically uncomfortable for you. Meanwhile, back in the calmer, more intellectual circles, a bunch of important people met for the Stamp Act Congress in New York in October 1765. This was significant because it was the first time that a large group of colonies, 9 of them actually, sent delegates to coordinate an intercolonial response. They issued declarations affirming their loyalty to the Crown, but very firmly stating that Parliament had no right to tax them because they had no representation. It was polite, but also a giant, formal, public finger wag. But the real power move was the boycott. Colonial merchants simply agreed not to import British goods until the Stamp Act was repealed. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is how you get the attention of an empire. When British merchants, facing cancelled orders and sinking profits, started screaming at Parliament, suddenly the Stamp Act looked like a much less wonderful idea. Money, as always, speaks louder than constitutional philosophy. So, in 1766, less than a year after it was enacted, Parliament sheepishly repealed the Stamp Act. Hooray! The colonists cheered, and everyone thought the problem was solved. The British had backed down. But here is where they had to save a little face, because they couldn't just admit the colonists were right. That would never do. The very same day they repealed the Stamp Act, they passed the Declaratory Act of 1766. This was purely an act of political vanity. It basically said, we repealed the tax because we felt like it, but just so we're clear, Parliament has the full power to make laws and statutes of sufficient force and validity to bind the colonies and people of America in all cases whatsoever. In other words, yes, we took the tax away, but don't you dare think you actually won. We still own you. So you have one side that thinks they've won a constitutional victory, and another side that has formally and very clearly stated that they have absolute total power. This is the definition of a ticking bomb, but one that is moving in slow motion, which is just perfect for us tonight. Take a deep breath. We're just getting warmed up. The British still haven't learned their lesson, of course. That would be too easy.
So, the Declaratory Act was basically a giant paper tiger roaring about power, but not really doing much right then. But that wouldn't last, because governments, particularly imperial ones, have a tendency to want to exert that power, especially when they're still broke. Enter Charles Townshend. He was the Chancellor of the Exchequer, which is basically the guy in charge of money, and he was, shall we say, a man who believed firmly in British authority and colonial obedience. He also believed in finding new ways to generate revenue from those rather difficult American colonies. So, in 1767, he proposed a series of acts that would become known as the Townshend Acts, or more commonly, the Townshend Duties. These duties were different from the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act was an internal tax, a direct tax on transactions within the colonies. The Townshend duties were external taxes, meaning they were duties placed on imported goods coming into the colonies. The idea was that the colonists had grumbled about internal taxes, but perhaps they wouldn't mind external ones quite so much, as these were more like traditional trade regulations. The items taxed were things like glass, lead, paints, paper, and, most importantly, tea. Of course, tea. It's always about the tea with these people. The revenue generated from these taxes was intended to pay the salaries of colonial governors and judges. Now, this sounds fairly innocuous, but it was actually a very cunning and ultimately very stupid move. You see, colonial assemblies traditionally paid the salaries of their governors and judges. This gave the assemblies a certain amount of leverage, a bit of quiet power. If a governor was being particularly difficult, the assembly could, shall we say, delay his paycheck? But if governors and judges were paid directly by the crown from these new tax revenues, they would be much less accountable to the colonial assemblies and much more loyal to London. It was a subtle shift in power dynamics, designed to make colonial governments more subservient. And, because why not add insult to injury, the Townshend Acts also authorized writs of assistance, which were essentially general search warrants that allowed customs officials to search any ship or building for smuggled goods. No specific probable cause was needed, just a general, looks a bit shifty, let's poke around. This was, understandably, seen as a gross violation of personal liberties by the colonists. Imagine someone just casually strolling into your home because they feel like it. Not great. The colonists' reaction was, once again, a mixture of formal protest and economic action. The cry of taxation without representation came roaring back. They didn't care if the tax was internal or external. If they weren't represented in Parliament, Parliament shouldn't be taxing them. It was a matter of principle, and colonists, as we know, can be very principled when their wallets are involved. The most famous response came from John Dickinson, a Pennsylvanian lawyer who wrote a series of widely circulated essays called Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania. Dickinson argued in a very calm, reasoned, and thoroughly academic tone, perfect for our sleepy purposes, that Parliament could regulate trade, but it could not levy taxes designed to raise revenue without colonial consent. It was a very subtle distinction, but a crucial one for the colonists. He basically said, you can tell us what to do with trade, but you can't just take our money. Colonial assemblies led by Massachusetts started to organize. Samuel Adams, a perpetually agitated Bostonian and master of political maneuvering, drafted a circular letter, which was sent to all the other colonial assemblies. It condemned the Townshend Acts as unconstitutional and urged the colonies to resist. The British response to this circular letter was, naturally, to panic slightly. They ordered the Massachusetts Assembly to retract it and warned other colonial assemblies not to endorse it. When Massachusetts refused, its assembly was dissolved.
This, of course, only made Samuel Adams and his compatriots look like defiant heroes, which was, again, not a very clever move by the British. And just like with the Stamp Act, the most effective resistance came from boycotts. Merchants and consumers once again agreed not to import British goods. Women in particular played a crucial role in these non-importation agreements, encouraging homespun clothes and refusing to buy British tea. This was a quiet revolution happening in parlors and kitchens across the colonies, a very polite but very firm no. As the boycotts began to bite, once again, British merchants started to suffer. And when British merchants suffer, Parliament listens. So, in 1770, bowing to economic pressure and recognizing that the duties weren't generating nearly as much revenue as expected, Parliament repealed most of the townshend duties. Most of them. Because, as always, they had to save face. They repealed the duties on glass, lead, paints, and paper, but they very deliberately kept the tax on tea. Why tea? Well, primarily to uphold that principle from the Declaratory Act, that Parliament did have the right to tax the colonies. It was a symbolic tax, a little flag planted in the ground saying, "We still have power, remember?" So by 1770, the situation seemed to calm down again. The economy picked up, most of the hated taxes were gone, and things went back to a kind of uneasy normal. But it wasn't really normal. The underlying tension was still there. The question of parliamentary supremacy still unresolved. It was less a solution and more like putting a very thin, very fragile Band-Aid over a slowly festering wound. And then, because life is never that simple, something very dramatic happened, though it started, of course, with a very quiet, very boring argument. On March 5, 1770, a small crowd of colonists in Boston started harassing a lone British sentry. Words were exchanged, snowballs and possibly rocks, depending on whose story you believe, were thrown, and more soldiers arrived. In the ensuing confusion, shots were fired and 5 colonists were killed. This event, immediately dubbed the Boston Massacre by propagandists like Samuel Adams and Paul Revere, who promptly created a very dramatic and completely inaccurate engraving of the event, was a major turning point. Now, it wasn't really a massacre in the sense of a planned wholesale slaughter. It was a chaotic street brawl that went tragically wrong. The soldiers were actually defended in court by John Adams, Samuel's cousin, a man who believed in due process even for unpopular redcoats. Most were acquitted. 2 were found guilty of manslaughter and branded on their thumbs. It was a relatively fair trial, all things considered. But the narrative of the Boston Massacre was what mattered. It became a powerful symbol of British tyranny, of innocent colonists being gunned down by oppressive soldiers. It helped galvanize anti-British sentiment, even though things calmed down for a few years after the repeal of most of the townshend duties. It just proved that the British presence and British power could lead to bloodshed. This wasn't just about taxes anymore. It was starting to feel like a matter of life and death, albeit a very slow, very drawn-out political death. For the next 3 years, we enter what historians often call the quiet period. The economy was good, most of the irritating taxes were gone, and people were mostly just getting on with their lives. The Sons of Liberty dialed down the street protests, and the British military presence in Boston was reduced. Everyone collectively breathed a sigh of relief. This, of course, meant that everyone was getting complacent, which is exactly when things are about to go completely off the rails. Let's just gently float over to another rather dull, seemingly insignificant piece of legislation that would eventually spark the next big crisis. Because, it's always the quiet ones that get you. And it's always about tea.
The entire crisis was reignited by a piece of legislation that was actually designed to help a struggling corporation, not to torment the colonists. This, of course, is the great irony of history. The most world-changing events often spring from the most mundane, bureaucratic reasons. Our star player in this act is the East India Company. Now, this was not just any company. It was a massively powerful, quasi-governmental organization that basically ran India for Britain. But by the early 1770s, it was struggling. It had enormous financial problems, and part of that problem was a massive surplus of tea, millions of pounds of it, sitting in British warehouses just getting stale. Nobody was buying it, mostly because the colonists were still boycotting the legitimately taxed tea, preferring the cheaper, smuggled Dutch variety. Of course they were. So, in 1773, Parliament passed the Tea Act. This act was designed to save the East India Company from bankruptcy. How did they plan to do this? By giving the company a near monopoly on tea sales in the colonies, and, crucially, allowing them to sell their tea directly to consumers without going through colonial middlemen. They also kept the tiny, symbolic Townshend tax on the tea itself. Here's the brilliant plan, according to London. The East India Company could ship its tea to America, even with the small tax, and because it was avoiding the expense of colonial merchants and middlemen, it could sell the tea cheaper than any competitor, including the smuggled Dutch stuff. The colonists would get cheaper tea, the East India Company would be saved, and the Crown would quietly, gently collect that revenue, thus maintaining Parliament's principle of the right to tax. A triple win. Except it was a spectacular misreading of the American mood. The colonists didn't see cheaper tea. They saw a massive attack on two very sensitive points: mercantile independence and constitutional principle. First, the colonial merchants, who had previously acted as the middlemen, were furious. This act cut them out completely, threatening their profits and their businesses. They saw it as the British government using its muscle to prop up a favored company and destroy local competition. This turned a powerful group of elites against the Crown. Second, the constitutional issue. The colonists, particularly the agitators in Boston, weren't buying the tea because they still believed that paying the tax, no matter how small, tacitly acknowledged Parliament's right to impose taxes on them without their consent. They didn't care that the tea was cheaper. This was about principle, and principle, as we know, can be very, very expensive. The Sons of Liberty organized immediately to prevent the East India Company tea from being landed. They used intimidation and public pressure to force the company's designated consignees, the local agents supposed to receive the tea, to resign their posts. In most ports, New York, Philadelphia, Charleston, the resistance worked. The tea ships were either turned back before they could dock, or the tea was unloaded and stored in damp cellars where it quietly rotted. No muss, no fuss. But then there was Boston. In Boston, the consignees were two sons of Governor Thomas Hutchinson, and the governor was absolutely determined to see the law enforced. He was a proper stickler for rules and apparently a bit slow on the uptake regarding the colonists' collective mood. When 3 tea ships, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver, arrived in Boston Harbor, Hutchinson refused to allow them to leave the port without paying the duty and unloading the cargo. Under customs law, if the duty wasn't paid within 20 days, the authorities could seize the cargo. Samuel Adams and the Sons of Liberty were in a staring contest with the governor. Hutchinson wouldn't back down, and Adams knew that if the ship stayed long enough, the tea would eventually be unloaded, the tax paid, and the principal would be lost. So on the night of December 16, 1773, a group of colonists, perhaps 100 or so, dressed rather unconvincingly as Mohawk Indians, because nothing says colonial protest like a poorly executed costume, marched down to Griffin's Wharf. This was not a stealth operation, by the way. It was done in front of a substantial, watching crowd. They boarded the 3 ships, and over the course of about 3 hours, methodically dumped 342 chests of tea into Boston Harbor. This was the Boston Tea Party. It was incredibly focused, highly disciplined, and financially very damaging. It destroyed tea worth about 10,000 pounds, well over $1.7 million today. Crucially, nothing else was damaged. Not the ships, not the rigging, not even a single personal item was stolen. They just destroyed the tea. They even replaced a broken padlock. They were very tidy anarchists, these guys. The reaction in London was not one of philosophical understanding. It was one of absolute, unmitigated rage. King George III himself declared, "The die is now cast. The colonies must either submit or triumph." The British government viewed the Tea Party not as a high-minded protest over constitutional rights, but as an act of criminal vandalism and outright defiance of imperial authority. This was the moment they finally decided they had had enough of Boston's nonsense. They responded, of course, by making things exponentially worse. In 1774, Parliament passed a series of harsh measures designed to punish Massachusetts, and specifically to make an example of Boston. The colonists immediately dubbed these the Intolerable Acts, though the British officially called them the Coercive Acts. The goal was simple: force Boston into submission, prove the absolute supremacy of Parliament, and thereby deter any other colony from similar mischief. There were 4 main acts, and each was a masterclass in heavy-handed, counterproductive governance. The Boston Port Act. This was the first and immediate punishment. It closed the port of Boston to all shipping until the destroyed tea was paid for. This was economically devastating to the entire city. It was the equivalent of shutting down the colony's primary commercial heart. The Massachusetts Government Act. This was an attack on self-rule. It basically neutered the colonial government, drastically reducing the power of the Massachusetts Assembly, prohibiting town meetings without the governor's permission, and ensuring that the governor's council was appointed by the Crown, not elected. It effectively turned Massachusetts into a royal dictatorship. The Administration of Justice Act, or the Murder Act as colonists called it, permitted British officials or soldiers accused of crimes in Massachusetts to be tried in Britain or another colony, rather than facing a potentially biased local jury in Massachusetts. The colonists naturally saw this as license for soldiers to commit crimes with impunity. The Quartering Act. This applied to all colonies and mandated that colonial authorities must provide lodging for British troops, potentially even in private homes or occupied buildings if necessary. This was a physical, daily imposition of the British military presence and a symbol of colonial subordination. These acts were intended to isolate Massachusetts and make the other colonies think twice. The result, of course, was exactly the opposite. The other colonies, far from abandoning Massachusetts, saw these acts as a direct threat to their own liberties. They realized that what Parliament could do to Boston today, it could do to Philadelphia or Charleston tomorrow. The acts became a powerful unifying force. Food and supplies poured into blockaded Boston from the other colonies, in an act of powerful, unified solidarity. And this, my friends, is where we finally move from angry petitioning and boycotts to the formal organization of revolution. The response to the Intolerable Acts was the calling of the First Continental Congress.
The sheer stupidity of the British in thinking that punishing one colony would scare the others straight is truly remarkable. Instead of isolating Massachusetts, they basically handed the Sons of Liberty and their allies the perfect unifying cry. So in response to the Intolerable Acts, 12 of the 13 colonies, Georgia, bless its heart, was too busy being small and reliant on British subsidies for defense against Native American tribes, so they didn't show up right away, sent delegates to Philadelphia. This was the First Continental Congress, which met in September 1774. Imagine a room full of intensely serious, slightly uncomfortable gentlemen, all wearing their best wigs and carrying their largest political grudges. They were lawyers, merchants, planters, and very successful people generally, the colonial elite. You had your radicals like Samuel Adams and his firebrand cousin John Adams from Massachusetts, who were already whispering about independence. You had your highly respected, more moderate Virginians like George Washington and Patrick Henry, who was famously about to start yelling about liberty or death.
And you had your ultra-moderates from Pennsylvania and New York who still desperately wanted to patch things up with Mother England. The goal of this first meeting was not independence. Let's be very clear about that. It was to coordinate a collective resistance to the coercive acts and to define the constitutional rights of the colonists. They still considered themselves loyal British subjects. They just wanted their rights respected, specifically the right to govern themselves internally and not be taxed without their consent. They were looking for a constitutional compromise, not a divorce. They debated for weeks, slowly, meticulously, because these gentlemen loved debating. The key result of the Congress was the Declaration and Resolves. This document affirmed the colonists' rights to life, liberty, and property, and specifically rejected Parliament's authority to tax them or legislate on internal colonial matters. They were saying, Parliament can regulate our external trade, but that's it. Keep your hands off our local business. But the real practical weapon they forged was the Continental Association. This was essentially an agreement to enforce a comprehensive intercolonial boycott of all British goods. It went beyond just merchants. It established local committees of inspection in every county and town to enforce the non-importation, non-consumption, and eventually non-exportation agreements. This was a hugely powerful move, creating a shadow government structure that could monitor citizens' behavior and essentially police the colonies. It was the colonists using economic warfare, the one thing they knew truly terrified London. Before adjourning in late October, the delegates agreed to meet again in May 1775 if their grievances were not addressed. It was a polite, formal ultimatum. Fix this, or we'll be back, and we'll be angrier. Meanwhile, back in Massachusetts, things were getting very tense very quickly. Governor Thomas Gage, who was also the commander-in-chief of British forces in North America, dissolved the Massachusetts Assembly, of course. In response, the local political leaders, the same ones who had formed the Continental Association, simply formed their own provincial Congress and began operating as the de facto government, training militias and stockpiling arms and ammunition. This is the point when the colonists stop being mere protesters and start preparing to be revolutionaries. These local militias were called Minutemen because they were supposed to be ready to fight at a minute's notice, which frankly sounds exhausting. General Gage, sitting in Boston, knew he had a powder keg on his hands. He realized he needed to assert control and prevent the colonists from fully arming themselves. This brings us to April 1775 and the very quiet, very sleepy end of the quiet period. Gage received orders from London to suppress the open rebellion in Massachusetts. He decided his best bet was a stealth mission to seize colonial arms and arrest a few key ringleaders, namely Samuel Adams and John Hancock, who were hiding out in the town of Lexington. So on the night of April 18, 1775, Gage sent a detachment of about 700 British troops, the famous Redcoats, from Boston under the cover of darkness, marching toward Concord, a town about 18 miles away where the colonists had a major arsenal. Of course, the colonists had excellent intelligence. The famous warning system, 1 if by land, 2 if by sea, was activated, and riders were dispatched. Paul Revere and William Dawes, and later Dr. Samuel Prescott, rode out to alert the countryside. We always hear about Revere, but Dawes and Prescott were just as important. They all rode like absolute maniacs through the sleepy New England night, waking up farmers and warning them that the British were coming. The next morning, April 19, 1775, the British column reached the village green in Lexington. Waiting for them was a tiny, hopelessly outnumbered company of about 77 Minutemen. Their commander, Captain John Parker, famously told his men, in a very calm, quiet way, to stand your ground, don't fire unless fired upon, but if they mean to have a war, let it begin here. The ensuing encounter was chaotic, terrifying, and utterly confusing. but it certainly wasn't organized warfare. Someone fired a shot. To this day, historians debate whether it was a colonist or a nervous redcoat. The shot heard around the world, and the British troops immediately fired a devastating volley. When the smoke cleared, 8 Minutemen lay dead, and several others were wounded. The rest scattered. The British soldiers, having essentially routed the small militia, marched triumphantly on to Concord. In Concord, the British successfully destroyed some military supplies, but the vast majority had already been moved thanks to Revere's warnings. As the British troops searched, a larger group of colonial militiamen and Minutemen had gathered at the North Bridge. A fight broke out there, too, and this time the colonial militia held its ground, forcing the British to retreat. The real disaster for the British began on their march back to Boston. Thousands of colonial militiamen, alerted by the riders, now lined the entire 18-mile route. They didn't fight in neat European lines, of course. They fought behind trees, stone walls, and buildings. It was a terrifying, running ambush. The British column was under fire virtually non-stop for the entire retreat. They were exhausted, low on ammunition, and absolutely bewildered by this new style of guerrilla warfare. Only the arrival of reinforcements saved the British force from complete annihilation. By the time they staggered back into the safety of Boston, the British had suffered over 270 casualties, dead, wounded, and missing, while the Americans suffered fewer than 100. This wasn't a great battle. It was a bloody, messy, frantic day of skirmishing, but it was the definitive end of the political back and forth. Lexington and Concord marked the point of no return. The shot heard around the world was less a loud explosion and more a gentle, steady drip of blood that finally solidified the crisis. The revolution had begun, not with a formal declaration, but with a very confused firefight on a chilly New England morning. Now, we move on to the rather surreal moment when the colonies had to officially decide what to do next, which naturally involved more slow, methodical meetings in Philadelphia.
In May 1775, the delegates reconvened in Philadelphia, just as they had promised the year before. This was the Second Continental Congress. They met against the backdrop of war, yet most still felt intensely reluctant to sever ties with Great Britain. Think of it as a very tense family meeting where someone has just punched Uncle George, but everyone is still debating whether they should ask him to leave or just agree to never talk about politics again. The Congress immediately faced two massive, unavoidable problems. First, they had a war to fight, but no army. Second, they had no central government, no money, and no official authority. The colonies were 13 separate entities now suddenly thrust into a collective military effort. Their first crucial decision was to create an army. They formally adopted the militias besieging Boston and called this new ragtag force the Continental Army. But who would lead it? This required picking a commander-in-chief, a person of sufficient gravitas and experience to command respect from delegates representing different regions and different military traditions. They settled on a tall, quiet, extremely wealthy Virginian planter and veteran of the French and Indian War, George Washington. Now, Washington wasn't chosen because he was a strategic genius. His military record was actually quite mixed. He was chosen precisely because he was a Virginian. This was a calculated political move to bring the most powerful Southern colony fully into the fold of a war that had so far been mainly a New England affair. He was unanimously appointed in June 1775. Washington, being the intensely reserved and honorable man he was, famously accepted the post but refused a salary, only asking for his expenses to be covered. Of course he did. He was George Washington, after all. The Congress then had to figure out how to pay for things. They decided to print paper money, which, naturally, was backed by absolutely nothing except the promise of future taxes by a government that didn't yet exist. This was the start of the revolution's chronic, debilitating financial problems. Despite mobilizing for war, the delegates made one final, desperate, rather sad attempt at peace. In July 1775, they adopted the Olive Branch Petition. This document, drafted primarily by John Dickinson, was a formal plea to King George III, declaring the colony's loyalty to the crown and humbly asking him to intervene to stop the aggressive actions of Parliament and its ministers. They essentially said, "Dear King, we love you, but your government is terrible. Please fix them." The tone was respectful, almost pleading. It was a clear effort by the moderates to keep the door open for reconciliation. However, at the same time, because they were deeply conflicted, Congress also issued the Declaration of the Causes and Necessity of Taking Up Arms, which explained why they were currently fighting the British Army. So they were simultaneously saying, "We love you and want peace," while shouting, "But we are armed and prepared to fight you." Very mixed messaging. The Olive Branch Petition was a total bust, of course. King George III refused even to read it. He had already decided the Americans were rebels. In August 1775, before the petition had even arrived, the king issued the proclamation for suppressing rebellion and sedition, declaring the colonies to be in an open state of rebellion. This completely rejected the colonists' claim that they were loyal subjects merely defending their rights. The king was closing the door. This act was crucial. It shifted the constitutional argument. The colonists had always focused their anger on Parliament and the king's ministers, hoping the benevolent king would save them. Now the king himself had labeled them traitors. This made reconciliation nearly impossible and dramatically increased the momentum toward independence. But still, the delegates dragged their feet. Why? First, there was fear. They knew that declaring independence was an act of treason, punishable by execution. They were wealthy men with homes, families, and fortunes to lose. Second, there was the hope that military action would force Britain to compromise, not separate entirely. Third, and perhaps most importantly, there was tradition and sentiment. These were men who had grown up proud to be British, beneficiaries of the British system. Cutting that tie was a massive psychological hurdle. What finally pushed them over the edge wasn't a military victory because they weren't really winning much yet. It was a little pamphlet published in January 1776 that managed to articulate the previously unspeakable. Entered Thomas Paine, a recent immigrant from England, a stay-at-home political writer with a genius for clear, fiery prose. Paine published Common Sense, and this little unassuming document absolutely tore through the colonies like wildfire. It was short, written in plain language that anyone could understand, and it was devastatingly effective. Paine attacked the very concept of monarchy and hereditary rule. He called King George III a royal brute and ridiculed the idea that a continent should be perpetually governed by an island. He argued logically and passionately that the time for reconciliation was over, that fighting for British rights was pointless, and that the only logical, sensible future was complete independence and the establishment of a republic. Common Sense was an instant, massive bestseller, selling an estimated 150,000 copies in a few months in a population of just over 2 million. It took the abstract, legalistic debate about taxes and rights and turned it into a clear, moral, and political imperative for independence. It was the psychological push the delegates needed. By the spring of 1776, momentum for independence was unstoppable. North Carolina was the first to explicitly authorize its delegates to vote for independence, followed by Virginia. In June, Virginia delegate Richard Henry Lee introduced a resolution to Congress that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved. This was the formal step.
Congress postponed a decision for 3 weeks to allow time for delegates to get instructions from their respective assemblies and, importantly, to prepare a formal, written explanation for this massive, terrifying step. A committee of 5 was tasked with drafting this explanation, which, of course, became the Declaration of Independence. The committee included the elderly, witty Benjamin Franklin of Pennsylvania, the deeply intellectual John Adams of Massachusetts, and the task of writing the draft fell primarily to the youngest member, Thomas Jefferson of Virginia. So while the main Congress was debating and agonizing, Jefferson, a famously reserved, slightly high-strung intellectual, sat alone in his rented room in Philadelphia and spent a few weeks quietly writing one of the most consequential documents in world history. He wasn't writing a legal brief or a list of complaints. He was writing a philosophical justification for revolution, a lofty appeal to the laws of nature and of nature's God. Finally, on July 2, 1776, Congress formally voted on the Lee Resolution. 12 colonies voted in favor. New York abstained, but quickly came around. The colonies were officially independent. John Adams wrote excitedly to his wife Abigail, proclaiming that July 2nd would be celebrated forever as the most memorable epoch in the history of America. Of course, it's July 4th we celebrate. Why? Because the delegates still had to argue over and approve the document that explained why they had just done this. For 2 more days, they debated Jefferson's draft, making some 86 minor changes, including deleting a passionate passage where Jefferson blamed the king for promoting the slave trade, a passage that the delegates from South Carolina and Georgia, who were large slave holders, insisted be removed. Oh, the ironies of freedom! The final version of the Declaration of Independence was approved on July 4, 1776. It was read aloud, not always perfectly, and immediately copied and distributed. It was a formal, philosophical, and legally necessary announcement that they were not merely rebelling, they were establishing a new, sovereign nation based on a set of universal principles. Now all they had to do was win the actual war. A minor detail, really.
The war that followed the Declaration was not the glorious, quick march to victory you often see in the movies. It was a brutal, grueling slog that lasted 8.5 years. And for most of that time, the Americans were losing, or at best, barely holding on. Our focus here tonight, however, is not on the roar of cannons, but on the incredible, nearly continuous dysfunction on both sides. Let's begin with George Washington and the challenge of turning scattered, independent militias into a unified fighting force. Washington was a man obsessed with appearances, discipline, and the maintenance of dignity, which must have been incredibly difficult while commanding an army of farmers who often deserted to go home for planting season and treated their officers with casual democratic disrespect. Washington's strategy for the first few years was less about winning big battles and more about the art of not losing catastrophically. He knew he couldn't defeat the professional British Army, which was the most powerful fighting force on Earth at the time, in a straight-up fight. His goal was to survive, to keep the army intact, and to drag the war out long enough that Britain would get tired and decide it just wasn't worth the expense. It was a strategy based on pure, drawn-out attrition and endless patience. Almost immediately after the Declaration, the British demonstrated just how outmatched the Americans were. General William Howe, leading the largest expeditionary force Britain had ever sent overseas, landed on Staten Island, New York, in the summer of 1776. Washington, convinced that New York City was strategically vital, decided to try to hold it. This was a mistake. The resulting Battle of Long Island in August 1776 was a complete disaster for the Americans. The British absolutely outmaneuvered and routed Washington's forces. Washington was forced to execute a truly incredible, stealthy nighttime evacuation across the East River from Brooklyn to Manhattan, managing to save the bulk of his army from capture. This pattern continued throughout the fall of 1776. The British systematically chased Washington out of New York into New Jersey and across the Delaware River into Pennsylvania. By late December, the Continental Army was reduced to maybe a few thousand cold, starving, demoralized men whose enlistments were about to expire. The cause looked utterly lost. The entire revolution was hanging by the thinnest of threads, and this is where Washington pulled off a moment of genuine, if slightly chilly, brilliance. On Christmas night, 1776, Washington led his depleted, frozen army in a legendary crossing of the icy Delaware River. This was a logistical nightmare involving leaky boats, icy slush, and tired men. It was less a moment of Hollywood glamour and more one of shivering, cold misery. The next morning, they marched on Trenton, New Jersey, and surprised a garrison of Hessian mercenaries, German soldiers fighting for the British, who were likely still reeling from their Christmas celebrations. The American victory was quick and decisive, capturing nearly 1,000 prisoners with very few American casualties. A week later, Washington followed this up with another small victory at Princeton. These two engagements, Trenton and Princeton, didn't win the war, but they were absolutely vital. They were massive psychological boosts that saved the Continental Army from collapsing, encouraged enlistments, and restored crucial faith in Washington's leadership. It proved the Americans could win, even if only through clever maneuvering and sheer audacity. But the British were still incredibly powerful, and in 1777, General Howe decided to finally capture the American capital, Philadelphia. He sailed his army down the Chesapeake, landed, and proceeded to defeat Washington in two more large battles at Brandywine and Germantown. Philadelphia fell to the British in September 1777. Washington's army, battered but intact, remember the goal, don't lose the army, retreated to winter quarters at a place called Valley Forge, just outside Philadelphia. And this is where we settle in for a long, cold, painful stretch of misery. Valley Forge, winter 1777-1778, is the ultimate example of the sheer suffering and ineptitude that defined the war. The army didn't freeze because the American landscape was exceptionally harsh. It froze because the logistical and supply systems managed by the Congress were a complete joke. There was plenty of food and clothing available in the surrounding countryside, but Congress had no centralized system, no money to pay suppliers, and rampant corruption and inefficiency meant the supplies never reached the hungry men. Soldiers suffered terribly from exposure, disease, and starvation. Up to 2,000 men died that winter, not from British bullets, but from dysentery, typhoid, and the sheer cold. It was a catastrophic failure of governance, and it nearly broke the army. Yet despite all this profound misery, the army didn't dissolve. And while they were suffering, two things happened that turned the tide, albeit very slowly and very quietly. First, Baron von Steuben arrived. He was a flamboyant Prussian military officer, who was actually Polish and had inflated his title, but let's not worry about the details. He volunteered to help Washington. He didn't speak much English, but he was a brilliant drill master. He implemented a strict, standardized training regimen that turned the ragged, loosely disciplined American units into a respectable fighting force. He taught them how to move, how to load their muskets quickly, and how to use bayonets. He taught them to be an army during that long, awful winter. And second, and far more critical, was the battle happening far to the north, in upstate New York. While Howe was busy capturing Philadelphia, a different British army, under General Burgoyne, was attempting a massive, three-pronged invasion from Canada down the Hudson River Valley, aimed at isolating New England. It was a complicated plan, and complex plans in the 18th century rarely worked. Burgoyne, a vain and overly confident general known as Gentleman Johnny for his love of luxury and theatrics, was bogged down in the wilderness, his supply lines stretched thin and his supporting forces nowhere to be found. He was surrounded by a growing force of American troops and militia. In October 1777, Burgoyne was decisively defeated and forced to surrender his entire army of nearly 6,000 men at the Battle of Saratoga. Saratoga was not a strategic masterpiece. It was mostly a British logistical failure compounded by stubborn American fighting. But it was the single most important moment of the entire war up to that point. Why? Because it proved to Europe, specifically to a very interested and very snarky France, that the Americans could actually win a major engagement. They were a viable, if still shaky, independent force.
The news of the American victory at Saratoga arrived in Paris and was immediately celebrated by the French court, who were quietly, or not so quietly, reveling in the humiliation of their ancient enemy, Great Britain. The key figure here was Benjamin Franklin, the elderly, wise, and highly eccentric American representative in Paris. Franklin was a master of diplomacy and public relations, deliberately cultivating an image of a simple, wise philosopher in plain clothes, contrasting sharply with the powdered wigs and silks of the French court. He was an absolute sensation. Franklin used the victory at Saratoga as the final piece of evidence to convince the French foreign minister, the Comte de Vergennes, that the Americans were worth the risk. In February 1778, France formally recognized American independence and signed two crucial treaties, a treaty of amity and commerce and a treaty of alliance. This was an enormous, complicated undertaking, and it changed the war entirely. The French didn't just offer moral support, they offered massive military and financial aid. They provided ships, soldiers, guns, and perhaps most crucially, credit. The American Revolution, which was about to collapse under its own debt and logistical ineptitude, was now propped up by the deep pockets of the French monarchy. Oh, the irony, a fledgling republic being kept alive by one of Europe's most absolute monarchies. Spain and the Netherlands, seeing an opportunity to pick fights with Britain, eventually joined the war on the side of France, though not technically allied directly with the United States. The war, which had been a colonial rebellion, immediately exploded into a full-scale global conflict. Britain now had to worry about defending the West Indies, Gibraltar, and India, pulling crucial resources away from the primary fight in North America. This was the brilliant, if accidental, payoff of Washington's strategy of survival. With France now involved, the British strategy changed. They realized they couldn't simply corner and defeat Washington's army in the north. After 3 years of fighting in the middle and northern colonies that had yielded only the temporary capture of New York and Philadelphia, which they soon evacuated, the British decided to shift their focus to the southern colonies, Virginia, the Carolinas, and Georgia. The logic behind the Southern strategy was that the South was supposedly teeming with loyalists, colonists who remained loyal to the crown. The British believed that if they could capture key ports, use the loyalists to help govern and secure the territory, and then slowly move north, they could crush the rebellion from the bottom up. It seemed logical. It was not. The British started strong. They captured Savannah, Georgia in December 1778, and then in their most decisive victory of the war, they captured Charleston, South Carolina in May 1780. They took over 5,000 American prisoners, which was a catastrophic loss for the Americans. The war in the South immediately devolved into a brutal, often horrifying civil war fought between patriot and loyalist militias. This wasn't the formal European-style fighting of the North. This was vicious, localized guerrilla warfare, fueled by personal grudges, neighbor against neighbor, leading to atrocities and scorched earth tactics. The major British forces, commanded initially by General Charles Cornwallis, managed to crush the remaining Continental Army presence in the South at the Battle of Camden in August 1780. After that,
Cornwallis essentially controlled the Carolinas, but he had a huge problem: how to actually hold it. The American resistance, though repeatedly defeated in major battles, refused to die. This was largely thanks to a few clever, highly unconventional American commanders who mastered the art of guerrilla warfare, harassing the British supply lines and preventing them from asserting control over the interior. The most famous of these was Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox. Marion was a brilliant leader who operated exclusively out of the treacherous swamps of South Carolina. He led small bands of men, striking quickly at isolated British detachments, seizing supplies, and disappearing back into the inaccessible wetlands. The British could never catch him, and his constant, low-level harassment drained their resources and morale. He was an absolute master of the slow, irritating puncture wound.
Cornwallis made the fatal error of basing his strategy on the assumption of British naval superiority. For years, the Royal Navy had reigned supreme, moving troops and supplies at will along the coast. But 1781 was different. The French fleet, commanded by Comte de Grasse, made a crucial decision to sail from the West Indies up to the Chesapeake Bay. Washington, who was still loosely pinning down the main British force in New York, saw his chance. This was the moment for decisive action, the one chance to end the entire tiresome conflict. He coordinated with the French general Comte de Rochambeau, who commanded the French land forces in America, to execute a massive, deceptive strategic maneuver. Washington and Rochambeau pretended they were preparing for a grand assault on New York City, keeping the British commander-in-chief, General Sir Henry Clinton, completely fooled. Then, in August 1781, in a marvel of military coordination and secrecy, the combined Franco-American army, about 2,500 Continentals and 4,000 French soldiers, quietly slipped away from New York and began a forced, rapid march over 400 miles south to Virginia. This was a logistical nightmare carried out in intense summer heat, and it worked flawlessly. Meanwhile, in the Chesapeake Bay, the critical engagement was happening at sea. The French fleet, under de Grasse, encountered the British fleet attempting to relieve Cornwallis. In the Battle of the Chesapeake, or the Battle of the Capes, in early September 1781, the French won a decisive, strategic victory, forcing the battered British fleet to retreat back to New York. This was the nail in the coffin. When Washington and Rochambeau arrived in Virginia, they joined up with other American forces, creating a combined force of about 17,000 men. Cornwallis, with his 7,500 British and Hessian troops, was now completely trapped on the small Yorktown Peninsula, surrounded by a massive Franco-American army on land, and completely cut off from escape or resupply by the French Navy at sea. The siege of Yorktown began in late September 1781. It was textbook 18th century siege warfare, slow, methodical, and incredibly loud. The Allied forces dug parallel trenches closer and closer to the British defenses, relentlessly bombarding the town with artillery. This was not high drama. It was the slow, steady grind of overwhelming firepower. Cornwallis held out for about 3 weeks, hoping desperately that Clinton would arrive from New York with naval and military reinforcements. But the French controlled the sea lanes, and Clinton was too slow and too confused to break through. Finally, on October 17, 1781, Cornwallis realized his situation was hopeless. The continuous bombardment had destroyed his defenses, his men were sick and exhausted, and there was no relief in sight. He sent a note requesting a ceasefire and proposed terms. 2 days later, on October 19, 1781, the official surrender ceremony took place. Cornwallis, claiming to be ill, because, of course, no gentleman general wants to suffer the intense indignity of a formal surrender, sent his second-in-command, General Charles O'Hara, to hand over his sword. In a final snarky act,
O'Hara attempted to present the sword to the French general, Rochambeau, implying that the French, not the Americans, had won the victory. Rochambeau, being the proper gentleman, pointed O'Hara toward George Washington. Washington, in turn, refused the sword, signaling his own second-in-command, General Benjamin Lincoln, to accept the surrender from O'Hara. It was a beautiful, formal way of saying, "You can't even get the surrender right." The defeated British troops marched out to the tune of a melancholic English air, possibly "The World Turned Upside Down," which was quite fitting. The loss of nearly 8,000 troops at Yorktown was too much for the British Parliament to bear. When the news reached London, the Prime Minister, Lord North, reportedly staggered and cried, "Oh God, it is all over!" And he was right. Although the treaty wouldn't be signed for another 2 years and skirmishes would continue, Yorktown was, for all practical purposes, the end of the American Revolutionary War. The British public and Parliament, sick of the immense cost and the lack of decisive victory, had lost the will to continue fighting a far-off, exhausting war. Part 9. The Treaty of Paris and the Post-War Mess. The war didn't just stop instantly in 1781. The British still held major ports like New York City, Charleston, and Savannah. Washington maintained his army in the field for 2 more years, a necessary precaution in case the British changed their minds and decided to keep fighting. This period was a period of intense anxiety, low-level military unrest, and complicated negotiations. In Paris, the tedious process of forging a peace treaty began. The American delegation consisted of Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, who had successfully secured Dutch recognition and loans, and John Jay, a quiet, highly skilled diplomat. Their goal was simple: secure formal recognition of American independence and establish the largest possible boundaries for the new nation. The negotiations were complex and stressful, largely because the Americans had to deal with not only the British, but also with their own allies, the French. The French, remember, had entered the war for their own reasons, primarily to weaken Great Britain, not necessarily to create a strong American rival. They had their own interests, particularly concerning Spanish claims to territory west of the Appalachian Mountains. The French Foreign Minister, Vigeam, secretly tried to limit the size of the new United States and ensure that Spain received large portions of the Trans-Appalachian West. The American negotiators, particularly the highly suspicious John Jay, quickly realized this. Despite the terms of their alliance with France, which instructed them to negotiate only with French consent, the Americans decided to cut a separate, secret deal with Great Britain. The British, eager to separate America from its powerful European allies and save face, were surprisingly generous. They wanted to maintain commercial ties with the new nation and preferred a strong America to one overly reliant on France. The final Treaty of Paris, 1783, signed on September 3rd, was a triumph for American diplomacy, securing astonishing terms. Recognition. Great Britain formally recognized the United States as free, sovereign, and independent. Boundaries. The U.S. gained all the territory from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi River and from the Great Lakes in the north down to Florida, which was returned to Spain. This massive territorial gain was arguably the single most important achievement of the treaty. Fisheries. Americans retained fishing rights off the coast of Newfoundland, a key demand of John Adams. Debts and Loyalists. The U.S. agreed that Loyalists who had lost property during the war should be compensated, though Congress proved largely unable to enforce this, and that British creditors should be allowed to collect pre-war debts, which was slightly more enforceable. The terms were finalized, the papers were signed, and the exhausted troops could finally go home. The last British troops officially evacuated New York City on November 25, 1783. Washington, who had held the army together through years of misery and deprivation, dramatically and publicly resigned his commission to Congress a few weeks later. He didn't seize power, he gave it back, an action that cemented his world reputation as a selfless Republican leader. The fighting was over, the independence secured, and a new nation born. But the American story was far from peaceful. They had won the war, but they had to face the daunting, tedious, and often petty challenge of governing themselves. Part 10. The Early Republic and Institutional Meltdown. The United States, having just fought a revolution against central authority, was utterly terrified of creating a new, strong central authority. During the war, the national government consisted only of the Continental Congress, which had no real legal authority and operated solely by the goodwill and shaky cooperation of the states. To formalize this, the states had adopted the Articles of Confederation in 1781, just before Yorktown. The Articles created an intentionally weak central government, essentially a league of friendship among the states. It was government by committee, and it was a spectacular failure. It had a legislature, Congress, but no executive branch, president, to enforce laws, and no national judiciary to interpret them. Here's a breakdown of the sheer, quiet chaos the Articles created. No power to tax. Congress could only request money from the states. The states, predictably, ignored most of these requests. This meant the national government was chronically broke, unable to pay its soldiers, repay war debts to France and Dutch bankers, or even pay interest on those debts. No power to regulate commerce. Each state was free to enact its own tariff.
The chaos of Shays' rebellion and the looming threat of economic disintegration convinced a small but powerful group of national-minded leaders that something drastic had to be done. The system wasn't just flawed, it was fundamentally broken. So, in the sleepy summer of 1787, 55 delegates, mostly wealthy, well-educated, and well-connected individuals, gathered in Philadelphia for what was officially called a convention to revise the Articles of Confederation. Of course, they had absolutely no intention of merely revising them. They intended to completely scrap the old system and start from scratch. This was, essentially, a quiet, bloodless coup orchestrated by the nation's elite. George Washington was persuaded to preside over the convention, which was a brilliant political move. His mere presence lent immense legitimacy to the proceedings. The delegates, recognizing the intense political sensitivity of what they were doing, immediately voted to conduct all their debates in absolute secrecy. No minutes were published, no windows were left open, and the delegates were sworn to silence. This allowed them to speak freely, change their minds without public ridicule, and engage in the messy, high-stakes process of political compromise. The core problem they faced was how to create a central government strong enough to function, to tax, to regulate trade, to raise an army, and to pay its debts, without becoming so powerful that it threatened the very liberty they had just fought a war to secure. They were terrified of centralized authority, yet utterly dependent on it. The irony was thick enough to spread on toast. The debates, though conducted in secret and over many sweltering weeks, were fiercely contentious. The arguments often boiled down to two massive, seemingly irreconcilable conflicts. The conflict of size, large states versus small states. The very first major plan introduced was the Virginia Plan, largely the brainchild of James Madison, a diminutive, scholarly man who was obsessively prepared and would later be called the father of the Constitution. The Virginia Plan proposed a strong national government with a bicameral or two-house legislature. Representation in both houses would be based on the population of the states. The large states,
Virginia, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania loved this, of course, because it meant they would dominate the government. The small states, New Jersey, Delaware, etc., absolutely hated it. They felt that if representation was purely based on population, they would be swallowed up by the large states. They countered with the New Jersey Plan, which proposed peeping the existing structure of the Articles, where every state got one vote regardless of population. The debate ground to a halt. Small states threatened to walk out. It was solved only by what became known as the Great Compromise, or the Connecticut Compromise, introduced by Roger Sherman of Connecticut. This was a classic piece of American political ingenuity. The House of Representatives. The lower house would be based on proportional representation, or population, satisfying the large states. The Senate, the upper house, would have equal representation, or 2 senators per state, satisfying the small states. It was a clumsy, illogical, but entirely necessary compromise that saved the convention from immediate collapse. The conflict of slavery, North versus South. The second major conflict was, as always in early American history, about slavery. The northern states generally opposed the continuation of the slave trade and saw less need to count slaves as part of the population. The southern states, where the economy was inextricably linked to the institution of slavery, desperately needed a way to count their enormous enslaved population to boost their representation in Congress. This led to the deeply cynical and morally compromised 3/5 compromise. The delegates agreed that for the purposes of determining both a state's population, for representation and for federal taxation, enslaved people would be counted as 3/5 of a 3-person. It was a cold mathematical calculation that institutionalized the dehumanization of millions of people for the sole purpose of political power. For every 5 enslaved persons, the southern states would gain 3 votes in the House of Representatives. This compromise gave the South disproportionate power in the new government for decades, and, as we know, set the nation on a disastrous trajectory. Furthermore, another compromise was reached regarding the slave trade. Northern delegates wanted to abolish it immediately, while Southern delegates threatened to leave the Union if the trade was ended. The agreement was to permit the international slave trade to continue for another 20 years, until 1808, after which Congress could vote to end it. These 3 central compromises, the Great Compromise, the 3/5 Compromise, and the trade-off on the slave trade, were the unglamorous, highly political, and often morally dubious foundation upon which the new government was built. By the time they finished in September 1787, the delegates had created a revolutionary framework, a system of federalism, dividing power between the national and state governments, and a system of checks and balances, dividing the national government itself into 3 equal competing branches: the legislature, Congress, the executive, President, and the judiciary, the Supreme Court. It was designed to make governing slow, difficult, and dependent on consensus, thus preventing the rise of a tyranny. It was a government of, by, and for suspicion.